Well, hi there. This is a hummingbird, one of the most charismatic and bizarre of all birds. They're possibly the smallest dinosaurs that have ever existed, with the smallest being the bee hummingbird of Cuba, which weighs a little over 2.5 grams, about the same as a penny. Even the giant hummingbird of South America, the largest of them all, only weighs about 20 grams, which is less than a AA battery. But their smallness is just the beginning of their weirdness. Also on that list would have to be the way that they fly. And not just the fact that their wings can flap at more than 80 times a second, though that is thoroughly insane, but they do not fly like other birds whatsoever. And their wings are not like those of other birds. I mean, in their basic structure, they aren't very different from your arm. They have a humerus, a radius, and ulna. Unlike you and other flighted vertebrates like bats and pterosaurs, birds have a lot of fusion in their hand and finger bones, including a structure called a carpometacarpus, formed from the fusion of their carpal and metacarpal bones. And generally the wing pivots at the shoulder and bends at the elbow and wrist, which is important because birds, most birds at least, fly. But gravity generally discourages flight. To overcome gravity, you need lift. And lift is primarily delivered by the downward movement of the wings pushing the air down. Very similarly to the way that you push water down to lift yourself in water. But more the way that you need to push water when swimming down rather than up, because when you swim down, you're defying buoyancy in the same way that a bird is defying gravity. So if you stop pushing water up, you will start to float back to the surface. The problem is that your arms can't move in the same direction indefinitely. You can flap them, but only till they reach your sides. Then you're going to run out of water pushing ability. You'll then have to reset your arms to the above your head position. But if you do that, by raising your arms at basically a rewind of what you did to bring them to your sides in the first place, you'll end up pushing about as much water up in front of you as you just pushed behind, and you will totally negate the gains that you just made on your downstroke. And given that buoyancy is actively pulling you to the surface, if you're exerting the same force in support of buoyancy as you are defying it, then you might need to accept your limits and stay where buoyancy puts you. However, you don't necessarily need to play by these rules, because, like a bird, your arms can bend at the elbow and wrist. So you make your downstroke with your arms extended, maximizing the amount of water that you push behind you, and then, when it's time to reset, instead of undoing all of your gains, you can rather shrink the profile of your arms and raise them up while pushing much less water than you did on your downstroke. And while nobody can pull you down, the amount of downward thrust that you're producing versus the comparatively small amount of upward thrust that you create when resetting your arms allows you to push yourself down. All because your arms can bend. And this is the way that most flighted birds defy gravity. And now I've told you, so my responsibility is fulfilled. But hummingbird wings do not bend like this. They have hardly any ability to bend their wings, especially in flight. They're straight all of the time, which you would think would mean that hummingbirds should not be able to defy gravity. Even greatly increasing the rate at which you repeat counteracting wing beats would not do much to solve the gravity problem. It's still going to pull you down. And many of you have probably never seen a hummingbird, at least not in person. Hummingbirds are only found in the Western Hemisphere. But if you've ever had the opportunity to find one in a Western sky, then you know that they can fly. And when it comes to aerial acrobatics, no other bird can match them in renown. It's just that at some point in their evolutionary history, their ancestors became through with playing by the rules of someone else's game. And that game wasn't the game of physics.
In this house, we obey the laws of thermodynamics.
It was the game of flying high using the same basic mechanism as other birds. And the biggest rule that they decided to break is the one that you need to have an upstroke that pushes against your propulsatory interests. What if, instead, you just turned your wings over and pushed them down again? You know, like a bee, and not so much like a bird. Well, that's exactly what they do. They move their wings in sort of a figure eight, kind of like this, generating downward thrust during both major phases of their wing beat, allowing them to not only fly, but hover, fly backwards, and do all sorts of things that are impossible for other birds to do. But I've got to tell you, this totally unique style of flight really left me wondering what hummingbirds could possibly be related to. I mean, what could it be? The animal that I most often mistake for hummingbirds are hawk moths, but that's probably not the answer. And while we have more to discuss with hummingbirds before we can move on to their relatives, I will tell you that I was surprised at the actual answer. Surprised and filled with joy because it's a group that I love, just not a group that I suspected. Have you ever read a science headline and thought, wait, is that actually true? News coverage can be tricky. Some sources focus on the facts, others on flashy headlines, and some leave out key details altogether. That's why I appreciate Ground News, our long-term partners and sponsor of today's video. It helps us see how different sources report the same story so we can get the full picture. Ground News is an awesome app and website that gathers news from around the world and breaks down the political bias, reliability, and ownership of each source. You can compare headlines, check factuality ratings, and escape media bubbles. Take this wild discovery. Scientists just found a deep-sea supergiant isopod and named it Bothinomus vaderi, after Darth Vader. It really does look like him. Some sources, like Conservation News, focus on the science and its ecosystem impact. Others, like IFL Science, highlight its Star Wars connection and the fun side of the discovery. With Ground News, you can compare coverage and decide for yourself what's important. One of my favorite features is the blind spot feed. It shows stories that are underreported by one side of the political spectrum. So if a big science discovery or event isn't getting attention everywhere, you'll still know about it. And that's why I love Ground News, because it helps us stay informed without getting stuck in an echo chamber. And if you want to try it, you can get 40% off the Vantage plan this month. Just go to ground.news/Clint or hit the link in our description. But we have to get back to that flight because hovering flight turns out to be the most metabolically expensive form of vertebrate locomotion. Flapping flight is very energetically expensive, but at least you have momentum, so you don't need to generate as much thrust to keep yourself airborne. Hovering flight is momentum free, thus all lift is generated by continuous downward thrust. In other words, flying like this requires a tremendous amount of high energy fuel. And unsurprisingly, hummingbirds have the fastest metabolism of any vertebrate, which means that they need a lot of oxygen. Good thing that they have the insane respiratory anatomy of birds that we discussed in this video. But it also means they need a lot of food, and high calorie food. Proportionally, to eat as many calories as a hummingbird, you would need to eat something like 150,000 calories a day, which is over 250 Big Mac sandwiches every 24 hours. And that is, with all due respect, too many to process. So they can't be eating low-calorie items like fast food hamburgers. They need something with some real energy in it, like sugar water, and maybe the occasional insect for fiber. And fortunately, many plants have been giving away sugar water as a bribe to get animals to move their sperm for millions of years now. And hummingbirds are great at getting it with their long bills and crazy grooved tongues. Which is nice, because they might need to drink 14 times their own body weight in sugar water every day. They can starve to death in 3 to 5 hours, which makes night a real problem. Hard to see to fly around looking for sugar water, but too long to survive without sugar water. And you need to sleep sometime, but they can't. They die, so they hibernate instead. Well, basically. As we discussed in our video about tenrecs, hibernation by definition needs to be for a prolonged period of time. It is an extended period of what is called torpor, which is very different from sleep, because for one thing, your body temperature doesn't drop dramatically when you sleep. And while your metabolic rate may drop a bit, not by enough to keep a hummingbird alive through the night. Hummingbird metabolic rates can drop by as much as 95% on cold nights, and their body temperature by 25%. They don't sleep through the night, they pass the night in torpor. I once rehabbed a hummingbird overnight, and since it was too stressed to enter torpor, it was a long night, though both of us survived. Now, this isn't an end to the crazy adaptations to the hummingbird lifestyle that there are, and we should make a video about just hummingbirds in the future, but I want to get to that other big question. What are their relatives? I mean, nothing else is quite like a hummingbird. Or is it? Because I mentioned that hummingbirds, which are all in the family Trochilidae, are only found in the western skies. But if you're from the other side of the world, you may have seen these, sunbirds of the family Nectarinidae, which, as their family name may have already told you, also feed largely on sugar water. They are small and colorful with frequently iridescent feathers, with long bills and even longer tongues. They may not fly like hummingbirds, though they can hover to some degree. Would it be shocking to find out that they're related? No. But it turns out that this little bird is more closely related to an owl than it is to a hummingbird. Okay, what about this? I mean, if you're from anywhere near Australia, you're probably familiar with the hovering, nectar-eating honey eaters of the family Melophagidae. It wouldn't be much of a stretch to find out that it's a close relative of the hummingbird, but it's another owl cousin. So those aren't closely related to hummingbirds, though it does show that something related to owls could turn out to be something like a hummingbird. But since hummingbirds are not closely related to owls at all, maybe I should look at things that look like owls, but that are not closely related to owls. Like this, for example. Seems reasonable, right? No, nobody would think this. And yet, now we're getting pretty close. Because hummingbirds, like this creature, are both members of the bird clade Strysaures, often called the nightbirds. And so hummingbirds and this creature are more closely related to one another than either of them are to the sunbirds or the honeyeaters or the owls. And the clade Strysaures includes a total of 8 families. And of those 8 families, the family most distantly related to hummingbirds is one of my favorites. This one, the family Caprimulgidae, better known as nightjars, which were the birds that I saw the most often during our trip to the Peruvian Amazon, since I was filming all day and only really got to be out in nature at night when we would find these in the middle of our trails. Because nightjars are, unsurprisingly, active at night, when hummingbirds are quasi-hibernating. Though the Amazon is far from the only place that nightjars can be found. They're found on every continent except for Antarctica. Growing up by a lake in the Midwest, I frequently saw and heard a nightjar called a nighthawk, with their distinctive white wing stripes and unique calls flying in the evening catching insects, which is the main source of food for this group as a whole. And it wasn't strange that we found them in the trail. Most species are ground nesters, and they frequently rest on the ground in clearings, relying on their exceptional camouflage to avoid detection by predators. And it turns out that nightjars are the actual reason that I wanted to make this video right now. Hummingbirds are absolutely amazing, and I have wanted to talk about them and their insane wings for a long time. But recently, I saw some incredible photos of a nightjar with wings unlike anything I knew to exist in birds or any other animal. At least hummingbirds fly pretty much like insects. I almost couldn't believe that this bird could fly at all. Well, that bird was this, the pennant-winged nightjar. This one is a male. It's rare to see good photos of these because these incredible African birds are rare to see, and this wing morphology is only present in males and only during the breeding season. Probably because it can't be good for flight. Now, I have seen all sorts of extravagant tail and head crest morphologies in male birds. You know, things that don't have too much to do with flight. But I was unaware of such dramatic changes to wing morphologies until I discovered this majestic bird. This isn't even the only crazy nightjar that there is like this, but it is magical. Nightjars, including the aforementioned nighthawks, as well as porwills, generally have small feet that are almost useless for walking, and long, pointed wings that are great for fast flight and high maneuverability. And many of the nearly 100 species have rictal bristles, which are whisker-like feathers around their mouths that allow them to feel insects when they open their crazy mouths to grab one. Because yes, these birds were originally created by Jim Henson. And this might be my favorite thing about the Strysaures in general. They're pretty much all Muppets.
Dad, what's a Muppet?
Well, it's not quite a mop, and it's not quite a puppet, but man! So to answer your question, I don't know.
But this is one. Now, just slightly more closely related to hummingbirds than are the nightjars are these two Muppet families. Steatornithidae the oilbird, and Nyctibiidae, the Potoos. Now there's only one species of oilbird alive today, and it is a freaking South American fruit bat. Except for the fact that, unlike most fruit bats, they do navigate with echolocation. This is the only flying nocturnal frugivorous bird in the world, and it navigates using clicks. So they are nocturnal, echolocating, flying endotherms that eat primarily fruit. And where would you guess that a fake bat would spend the day? If you answered anything other than in a cave, you've not been paying attention. And you're also wrong, because they totally roost in caves during the day, though only about a third of the time outside of the breeding season. But they are in caves pretty much all of the days when raising offspring. They weren't just adopted by the darkness, they were born into it.
Molded by it.
In a lot of ways, oilbirds look like brown nightjars. They have little legs and rictal bristles, but they also have large hooked beaks and a conspicuous line of white spots on their wings running down their sides. So you shouldn't confuse them with nightjars. And it's also pretty easy to distinguish them from their closest relatives, the Potoos, using that line of white spots if nothing else. Potoos are also from South America, though they make their way up into Central America as well. All 7 species feed primarily on insects at night, which is still pretty bat-like, but they were born in the light, specifically on top of a tree stump. Not in a nest or anything, just in a depression in a tree stump somewhere. And while they still sleep during the day, they do not hide in the shadows, but they hide in plain sight, standing upright, also on a tree stump, face pointing to the sky, eyes just barely cracked open, just daring the world to notice them. But as long as they sit there, with their eyes mostly closed and their mouths shut, almost nobody would notice them. And when they get startled and open their eyes and mouths, well then nobody would even believe that this was a real animal. Be honest, with AI filling our feeds with more and more unrealistic images of animals, in 5 years nobody is going to believe in Potoos. But it is, and isn't it phenomenal? I mean, if you're looking for a favorite bird, can you objectively say that there is a more delightful favorite than this? And while the great Potoo, your new favorite bird, has black eyes, most have insane yellow eyes that are probably the funniest piece of startle coloration in the animal world. Anyway, the lack of spots and rictal bristles combined with the small beak and upright posture should set Potoos apart from the oilbirds. And nightjars don't stand upright like this either. So these are the 3 families in the Strysories most distantly related to the hummingbirds. And so far, I would say that they aren't very much like hummingbirds, at least at a glance. Delightful as heck, but not much like hummingbirds. A bit like owls, but not as owl-like as the next most distant relatives of hummingbirds in this clade, the ever-so-wonderful frogmouths of the family Podargidae, which, despite a quite conspicuous resemblance to owls, I mean to the point that you might need to teach somebody about facial discs just so they can notice that they don't have one, are actually Asia and Australia's response, not to owls, but to Potoos. Though they are actually more closely related to hummingbirds than they even are to Potoos, and closer to both of those than they are to owls. But they do look like a Potoo had a baby with an owl. And I guarantee that every frogmouth in a zoo has heard the word owl more than it's heard the word Potoo, or hummingbird. But they look like owls because, like Potoos, and unlike nightjars and oilbirds, they sit upright. Also like Potoos, they have big, often yellow eyes that are rather forward-facing, and a hooked bill, and a very cryptic mottled gray coloration. And unlike Potoos, they also have rictal bristles. And these are all elements that they share with owls. And many of the 16 species are a bit bigger and a bit more heavy-bodied. They just look more like owls than do Potoos, which look like ChatGPT owls. But again, the lack of facial discs that owls use to amplify their hearing should give them away quickly as not being owls. Not to mention their small, weak feet, which are nothing like the grabby murder feet of owls. And, of course, their giant Strysories Muppet frogmouths, unlike the silly little mouths of owls. Owl heads are made up of eyeballs and ears. Strysories agreed that big eyes are important for moonlight flight, but the rest should pretty much be mouth. Being on the wrong side of the world should give them away as not being Potoos, not to mention the rictal bristles. They also tend to roost more on branches than stumps, though they still don't use nests. They just lay their eggs on the fork of a tree. Now, the 4 remaining members of the clade Strysories are all more closely related to one another than they are to the frogmouths, or anything else we've discussed so far, except for the hummingbirds. One of them actually are the hummingbirds, and 2 of them are their closest relatives. So their next closest relatives, right after their 2 closest relatives, are these, the 12 species of owlet nightjars of the family Agothelidae, which are neither little owls nor nightjars, though obviously closer to the latter than the former. And being primarily from New Guinea, as well as other nearby places like New Caledonia and Australia, it would be possible to confuse them with nightjars, as well as frogmouths, despite the fact that they're more closely related to hummingbirds. In fact, you're more likely to confuse them with nightjars or frogmouths than you are with any of the 3 families that they're most closely related to, which probably shows you that the common ancestor of this group probably looked a heck of a lot more like an owlet nightjar than it did like the 3 groups that we have left to discuss. But before we get to them, we need to know how to distinguish an owlet nightjar from the other groups that we've discussed so far. And the reality is that for the most part, they just look like Strysaures. They're colored like you would expect, with large eyes, colossal mouths, pointy wings, rictal bristles, etc. Honestly, the best indicators are probably that they have long, rounded tails, and, this is a big one, almost normal bird feet, which was huge and functional for a member of this group. Some of them have a more falcon-like appearance, at least in my opinion, than do most of the other members of the clade that we've discussed so far. And that brings us to the end of the birds that you could confuse with owls or nightjars, because from here on out, it's all hummingbirds and their closest relatives. Real quick, I'm just going to tell you guys, the Patreon extras video for this is one of the most fun ones we've ever made, so if you're interested in seeing that, hop over and check out our Patreon. It also helps us make more content like this. We've already discussed hummingbirds enough for today, but not enough for life. I would love to do a full tour of hummingbirds or any of the other groups that we've discussed so far because they're all nuts. I mean, there were flightless owlet nightjars. And the pennant-winged nightjar isn't the only one with crazy display feathers on its wings. And everybody needs more Potoos in their lives. So let me know which of these groups you would like to learn about the most in the comments. But right now, we need to learn about the closest relatives of hummingbirds. And their closest relatives appear to be these 2 families. The family Apotidae, the swifts, and the family Hemiprocnidae, the tree swifts. Birds that look and act more like swallows than they do like hummingbirds. Of course, swallows are more closely related to owls than they are to swifts or tree swifts, but you probably guessed that by now. However, we might need to discuss swallows a bit in our discussion of swifts and tree swifts because they really do look very similar. Convergence is a female hyena. Now, there are only 4 species of tree swifts, but there are about 100 species of swifts, so I'll start with them. These are some of the fastest and most maneuverable of all birds. They have been clocked traveling, not diving, but flying at speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour. So swift is a fitting name. And their family name, Apotidae, means no feet, which probably tells you that unlike the owlet nightjars, these have little feet, if not no feet. And they do have feet, but they're not large. These birds, like most of the families that we've discussed, are exceptional aerial hunters of arthropods, though a big frogmouth might also take a bird or other vertebrate from time to time. But most swifts do this during the day, when they and the insects that they hunt can see better, so their flight capabilities are virtually unmatched. And much of that is thanks to the way that they flap their fairly rigid wings. Not so much like a traditional bird, but more like a hummingbird, generating thrust on both the upstroke and the downstroke. And suddenly the world begins to make sense. But just because they generally hunt in the day, that doesn't mean that they're afraid of the dark. Many live in caves and use echolocation to navigate in the darkness. And you know that pleases me. If you get a really good look at a swift, you will notice that it has very long, thin wings that are swept back like a boomerang. The wings of swallows are shorter and get more broad, especially near the body. And while both may have forked tails, the tails of swallows are often longer than those of swifts, but not always. The easiest way to distinguish between the two is if you ever see one perched on something like a wire or a tree branch. That is a swallow. They have bigger mouths than swallows, which probably comes as no surprise. But good luck getting a good look at that. Swifts can cling to the sides of things, but they rarely land in plain sight. Also, if you're seeing it every 2 minutes while watching a Chiefs game, it's probably a swift. They occur on every continent except Antarctica, so it's likely that you have seen them. That is a lot less likely unless you've been to India or somewhere else in the vicinity of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. But tree swifts look like their closest relatives, the true swifts, except generally with longer forked tails, more like those of many swallows, and often with head crests as well. And those are the closest relatives of hummingbirds. What group should we cover next? As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon.
They have wings.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Why do they have wings?
Why are they resting on the ground where they're...
It's almost like it's exhausting to fly around in the jungle all the time trying to avoid
But
trees.
Trees! I don't know.
These are not perching birds.
Yeah, I know. Why not?
Because they're not anywhere close to the Passeriformes. Otherwise, they'd be more closely related to owls.
Okay.
So their feet are not particularly good for grabbing onto little branches and things.
So what, but I guess, like, what...
In fact, these guys have tiny little feet.
Is this a niche, like, this was a niche that was, it's like, well, everybody else is in the trees, there's no room, I guess I'll stay on the ground? Like, I don't know.
Or I'm really bad at being in the trees, but I'm really cryptically colored.
Yeah.
So the ground is fine, and I'm doing great at it and making babies.
Yeah, that's scary though, the jungle, all the insects that are on the ground.
Good place if you're an insect-eating bird.
Yeah, real quick, I'm confused by this line. It's just that at some point in their evolutionary history, their ancestors became renowned?
No, through with playing by the rules of someone else's game.
Became through? And why don't I understand that sentence? Will, do you understand that sentence? Why?
Yeah, it is a little weird though.
That's alright.
It makes sense to you? Why does it make sense to you?
I'll explain it later.
So it's meant to be confusing so that you can explain it later thing?
Apparently.
Apparently. Alright.
Gotta get this smile off my face. Have you guys seen Wicked yet?
No.
It's really good.
Yeah?
There's one song as you edit this video that may come to mind many, 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 many times.
What?
Just letting you know.
There's one song that will come to mind?
Yeah.
What are we talking about right now?
Wait a second, did you enter the words you used in your script
No.
were from the song?
You
Gravity. Is it the gravity one?
You're such a nerd.
That's why the one that you said was awkward.
Is that why?
Here, I'm gonna pull up the list. Define gravity?
Yes.
Awkward words.
When Jason mentioned that and you were weird about it, I'm like, wait, there's a few other places. That doesn't sound right.